All right. Welcome to the Pulling the Threads podcast. Today I will be interviewing Ben Wagenmaker. Is that how you say your last name?
Yeah, Wagenmaker.
Wagenmaker. Um, was your ancestor, did they make wagons? I mean, is
I'm
that
sure
what
they did probably 6 or 7
probably?
generations ago.
Yeah. Yeah, so we connected on a couple of the forums on Facebook.
Mhm.
And you're currently going through a process of conversion. And so yeah, we're just gonna kind of do an interview. Do you want to kind of give a little bit of a background on yourself? First, just kind of like what you do, where you're at, and kind of how you come to this.
Sure, sure. Of course, I'll start by saying that, of course, they say there's nothing new under the sun. So I'm sure that some of the things I'll share, somebody out there can relate to it, even if it's just one person. If there's something I say that you can't relate to, that's fine. But someone else will probably relate to it. So that being said, my background is I come from a very, very Christian background. My parents, going back several generations, came from the established church tradition, and my mom came from the Baptist church tradition. Her dad, my maternal grandfather, was actually a Baptist minister for a time. And I grew up in the Baptist church, and I went to a Baptist school from K to 12. That means we had compulsory chapel every week regularly, and we had compulsory Bible classes where we studied the Bible on an academic level for 13 years. And so I was very biblically literate from an early age, where we had to study the Bible, not just read it. And we actually were encouraged to memorize not just verses, but chapters, entire chapters. I remember and that was part of the standard education of what we did in the Baptist church. They were very heavy on the scriptures. And of course, I knew, at least in my mind, I knew the Bible as good or better than a lot of people who went to seminary or went to Bible school after they graduated high school. But of course, in a standard Christian mindset, knowing the Bible, as it were, in air quotes, means knowing the New Testament and knowing the parts of what they call the Old Testament, as much as only to the extent that it confirms what the New Testament says. So basically, like any good Christian, I knew about the Torah, but I really only knew what the New Testament says about the Torah. I didn't really know the Torah itself, even though it was in my Bible the whole time, because as lots of people who grew up in a similar background know, the New Testament is considered the primary. That's considered the primary revelation, and the Old Testament was basically this mysterious thing that can only be interpreted with the light of the New Testament revelation. And so that's kind of how I grew up in the Baptist church, and that was my background until I was a young adult, and then I actually became a Pentecostal. And so that was actually a very dramatic change, going from Baptist to Pentecostal, in the sense that it was the same Bible, but it was a very different application of um, a lot of the same teachings. Um, to make a very long story short, parents were very concerned for me, and of course, Pentecostals tend to be concerned about Baptists and vice versa. And of course, as you and I both know, there are over 40,000 Christian denominations, and they're all concerned about each other's soul. So anyway, I was caught up in that for a while. And in my Pentecostal part of my journey, I discovered really good church music. One thing, I mean, say what you will about Pentecostal churches, they have excellent music. A lot of them have rock bands. They have good music mixes. They have light shows, especially the mega churches. And I visited a couple of mega churches in my time. And I got caught up with that. I was a church musician for years before that, but in the Baptist church, it was not quite as exciting because it's usually a piano or an organ, or at least it was at that time. And then when I became Pentecostal, I actually joined my first worship band. as a keyboard player and really enjoyed it. I was a worship leader for over 20 years. When my wife and I met, we were both worship leaders, and of course, she comes from the same background I have, that I came from. Her parents were both Christians going back a while. Her siblings are Christian. My siblings are Christian. Her cousins are Christian. My cousins are Christian. And so it's very deeply anchored in both my wife and I's journeys. Now, that pretty much brings me up to date up until last year.
Okay.
Part of,
So I kind of want to ask some questions.
sure,
You know, I don't want to move too fast through everything.
of course.
Um, One, I'm gonna ask some questions based on what you said. One, you said you were biblically literate.
Mhm.
Um, so you had studied, so the New Testament, you're reading, you know, the context, the whole chapter, not just the verse. And yet
Absolutely.
your view of the Old Testament was more reading verses, maybe that you saw in the New Testament, or where you felt like the verses confirmed the New Testament, but you had not yet started reading the Old Testament and looking at the whole chapter context yet.
That is pretty much it. And that is how a lot of biblically literate Christians operate. They're biblically literate to the point where they read the New Testament and they require a lot of integrity when they read the New Testament. It has to be in a context. And I was actually taught to study theology from the standpoint of, and this is something that is carried, that I've carried into Judaism with me, is there is a principle of let everything be established out of the mouths of two or three witnesses. And even in Jewish law, that's when someone is punished or accused of breaking a commandment under Jewish law, there needs to be witnesses. And so theologically speaking, I was taught that every doctrinal point should be established out of the mouths of two or three witnesses. And so what that means is that if you see one isolated verse that seems to confirm a weird theory, you can't just make a doctrine, you can't run and make a doctrine out of one possible interpretation of one verse. If it's going to be authoritative as a doctrine, it has to be established out of at least two or three sources within the Bible. And of course, in the Christian context, it would be in the New Testament. Now, in Judaism, I'm looking at taking the same principle, taking the pashat or the obvious interpretation of a meaning, and if it can be established out of two or three verses in the Tanakh, then I'm totally comfortable seeing it as a doctrine, something that's very foundational, something that could be a rule, not the exception.
Mm.
And so that's kind of how I was taught. And that was actually a very sound practice that I've actually carried over into Judaism with me.
Now, so I mean that's very interesting because if you apply the three witness the method you're talking about to the Old
Mhm.
Testament, now a lot of these passages that Christians use to say Jesus was a suffering servant or the various things in the Tanakh, they start to unravel because you don't have a consistency of witnesses that say the same thing. You have a verse that one, they're relying on a Greek Septuagint translation, not a Hebrew translation. So therefore, it's already lost its meaning from the original. And
Mhm.
then they're stringing verses together. But if you're looking at the whole chapter, the context is different. It's maybe speaking about Israel, not an individual.
Mhm.
So if you were to apply that three witness to, so kind of my question is, so how did, because I like in Bible college I learned exegesis, hermeneutics,
Mhm.
and we learned about the proper context of a passage and stuff. And
Mhm.
of course they applied it to the New Testament, but as a child myself I had read the Tanakh twice and the New Testament once, and I always had problems with the New Testament. And even though I was raised, you know, because my mom became a Jehovah's Witness, I was raised in that. And then like you, I went into a Pentecostal experience and then Messianic before converting to Judaism.
Mhm.
Um, but there were, yes, there were things that stuck with me. The exegesis, the hermeneutics,
Mhm.
trying to see what's in the passage, understanding to whom is being spoken to,
Mhm.
where, what, the why, the how, all this stuff. Now, those methods help me to like look into the passage deeper. But again, um, like even in Bible college, they briefly mentioned the document hypothesis regarding the Old Testament.
Mhm.
I don't know if they really got into. I don't think they ever got into textual criticism when it came to the New Testament. Maybe in passing, but the textual criticism, looking at how documents made, and looking into like the who, what, why, where, and how in the fullness of the passage is something that I always took when I was looking at passages. How did I guess did this play into your starting to look at the New Testament use of the Tanakh?
Mhm.
I prefer the term Tanakh over Old Testament.
Of course.
How did it start changing like your view of either the New Testament or Christian use of the Tanakh and
Okay. Well, I think there's two different ways to look at this. And I'm going to start with going back to my Christian mindset. I'm going to speak for the way I used to see, and I'm not going to suppose that Christians still see it this way or any other Christian views it this way. This is how I, when I was a Christian, viewed it. Using the three witness rule, the New Testament played very heavily better if the Old Testament mentioned something once. Okay. In that context, if the Old Testament, which we now call the Tanakh, I now call the Tanakh, but I use the Old Testament talking of my old life. But what I used to call the Old Testament, if there was just one verse that the New Testament repeated twice, to me, that was sufficient as the three witnesses. So if Isaiah 53 was mentioned, and they don't even it's allegorical. And it's the funny thing is allegory by definition is not clear. But people think it's clear and it's clearly X when it's really not X at all. But that's kind of the way they see it. If the New Testament interprets a Tanakh passage as X, then to a Christian, it's X and nothing else because the New Testament says so, because that is their word of God. So that plays heavily into their three witness rule, at least how I understood it back in the time. Now, fast forward to when the Tanakh started changing for me. Um, Fast forward to last year, up until the point of the beginning of last year, I had been a lifelong Christian and I was still a worship leader at my church. But I had started reading biblical Hebrew and learning biblical Hebrew. And so my focus was Tanakh, 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 less New Testament. And the more I read the Tanakh, the more I saw the discrepancies, the more I saw the eternal nature of God's covenant with Israel and how it was irrevocable. And, frankly, eternal means eternal, it's not replaceable. And this might seem like a very small detail, even to you or to anyone else. But to me, it was a very large detail to me, just the idea that in the New Testament, when Jesus claims to be the way, the truth, the life, and no man comes to the Father but by me, that's a claim of exclusive access to God. And that bothered me. It bothered me that he would say that he had exclusive access to God when God had an eternal distinct covenant that existed previous to him. He was around before he was in the portrait. So, and that bothered me so much that, you know, I finally had to reconcile the idea that both cannot simultaneously be true. One has to be true and the other is untrue. So, after probably several weeks of, um, I guess, painful introspection, I decided that the New Testament was not true, and I decided to just follow Torah after that and never looked back. Now, I don't know if you want me to keep going or if you have any questions to clarify.
I mean, if you try to keep track of where you're going and your thoughts, I do have some questions and stuff here and there that I may interject. But so for me, the three witness thing would
Mhm.
require it to be consistent within the Tanakh. You have to have three consistent witnesses in the Tanakh
Right.
for that to be something you can consider if there was an additional revelation or whatever. Um,
Mhm.
I find it highly dubious
Mhm.
to say there's one verse in the Tanakh and there's two to three confirmations in the New Testament. Well, honestly, to me, that would invalidate the New Testament by the simple fact that it's not first confirmed in the text they use for support.
Right.
So if the New Testament wants to, which I don't subscribe to it as inspired or inerrant. It's a human
Mhm.
document that
Right.
the full surviving copies we have are 4th century and beyond, maybe fragmentary before that. We have no original attestation of 1st century, whatever may have or did not exist, if it even existed. So, I mean, I don't take it as a true infallible word of God,
Right.
uh, as it's not. It's a human document that we know has had multiple layers of redaction.
Right.
Um, but all that aside, if we're going to discuss the merits of whether based on its own testimony, one
Mhm.
of the things that I did when I was converting because my mom became a Jehovah's Witness when I was like 4, that's how I was raised. When I was deciding to leave, one of the first things I did was like, well, let me test the thing against itself to see if it holds to
Mhm.
be true. Because I was hearing, from Christian apologists that it's a cult and there's this stuff. And so I started researching within its own movement, within itself, to see if it was true to itself. And so that I started looking into their translation of the Bible, the Greek and English interlinear,
Mhm.
trying to, study the Greek words and what was actually in the Greek text they used for theirs. And I found
Mhm.
inconsistencies there. So, kind of searching deeper, but something should hold true within itself. When you find
Yeah.
inconsistencies within itself, then you start have to question it. And I think maybe that's kind of a similar experience you had when you start to get into the Hebrew and you're starting to see some
Mhm.
inconsistencies. Um, I genuinely feel like if you want to start with you say the Old Testament's your foundation, um, then you need to find a consistent theme that can generally be recognized by the average unlearned mind. It doesn't have to be complicated, strange math, tinfoil hat conspiracy. Well, it says this vaguely, it says this vaguely, this allegory, and then it paints this picture. No, there needs to be 3 clear witnesses at least for there
Mhm.
to be a continuing. And if even, if you move into, say, Messianic or other Christians who kind of try to say, um, that it's grafting in
Mhm.
this kind of weird thing. Well, you can't graft into something if you disconnect and become something else. Like you're
Right.
not grafted in at all. If you don't follow the existing revelation and have a consistency within that, then whatever you're doing, you're not even grafted in. You're off in some other, existential realm. You're not in that same realm. So I feel like just for me, like
Mhm.
definitely that consistent theme of, yeah, minimum 3 clearly, like, easily understandable, you would need. um but yeah, um you had made the comment the Old Testament confirms only in reading the verses, whereas the context might, have a different meaning. Were there any passages specifically, like in the Tanakh? You did mention the eternal covenant. Were there any other passages when you were studying biblical Hebrew that started to stick out to you as maybe what the text is saying versus what the New Testament or Christianity is saying, didn't line up with what you had been led to believe in your Baptist or Pentecostal experience?
Actually, nothing really particular. Just the main passage that bothered me is the one that I mentioned earlier, John 14:6. That's the one that made me derail. That's the one that derailed everything for me. Because if John 14:6 is untrue, then that is a central teaching of what they call the New Testament. And if the central teaching of the New Testament is untrue, then the New Testament itself is untrue. And really, that is the one single passage that derailed my Christianity. That's the single passage. And other than that, I mean, since then I've noticed other inconsistencies, of course. Let's say in the book of Acts, you see two very different, even in the same book. It's funny how, you look at this in retrospect and you see that in Acts, I think it was Acts 9, Paul supposedly has his private vision that no one else witnesses. and there's Acts 9 and there's Acts 22. And don't quote me on this because I don't remember which is which, but in one of the chapters, the men who were with him saw nothing, but they heard a voice.
Mm-hmm.
But a few chapters later, they heard nothing, but they saw a light.
Yeah.
And it's in the same book. And come on, I mean, fiction writers are held to a higher standard than that.
Right.
If
The
you have a fiction,
inconsistency is, yeah.
it's crazy because of a fiction writer, I mean, J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter, if she had something remotely that flagrant
Mm-hmm.
in an inconsistency in her writing, she would be roasted mercilessly online. And that's, I mean, like, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that fiction writers are held to a higher standard.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if you want to accept something as the word of God, come on, have a higher standard at least than that of a fiction writer.
Right. I mean, it is fiction, but you know, that's another
Yeah,
story. I mean,
classic literature, classic literature.
classic
That's how we
literature,
say,
but yeah,
you
yeah.
know, I
But still,
respect
I
the New
mean,
Testament as
the
classic literature.
editorial standards at the time may not have been the same. They didn't have the same access to information that we do. Um, and so it was a lot easier to pass off a lie as a truth back then.
Yeah, there was no fact checkers or whatever back in the day. You know, people couldn't just Google whatever just to make sure it was true.
Right.
But even then, I mean, there were so many inconsistencies, and even when I was a Christian, there were known inconsistencies between the. And again, it goes back to the classic Christian argument, which is why I find laughable these days. They say that, you know, in a court of law, if you have four different witnesses, it's normal and expected for there to be certain inconsistencies between the stories. And if they are exactly the same, it's evidence of collusion. And, you know, that's fine in a court of law. But when you're talking about people that are inspired by God, again, there should be a higher standard. There shouldn't, I mean, I can understand, you know, some people remembering certain details that others didn't remember. But when people remember the same details very differently within the Word of God, it just seems like that's not a high enough standard for the Word of God. And especially when there's inconsistencies in the same book, like I mentioned in the book of Acts.
Yeah. Well, but that's a very problematic statement. Like, okay, let's circle back. And that's, you know, there's these claims that are made, and it's like there's cognitive dissonance going on. But for a judge to find somebody guilty, there's got to be clear evidence that, you know, beyond a reasonable doubt. So if you have four testimonies that are not consistent, they rise reasonable doubt. So you have, in a court of law, kind of going back to three, you know, if you have multiple witnesses, you need to have at least three that have the same basic consistent theme, that beyond a reasonable doubt, we can say, okay, that's most likely what happened. And maybe the fourth one has, you know, a different story and we can't explain it, but you still have to have 2 to 3 people. You know, when I remember looking at law stuff a long time ago, but you have to have a consistency of testimony that will leave you without reasonable doubt. If you have 4 people who give you reasonable doubt, you can't find somebody guilty. So even that analogy undermines, like, if you really look into it, it's like we hear these things and it's like, and I fell for it back in the day, the apologists, like, you know, their arguments, and you're like, oh, okay, you don't really critically look at it and go, wait, well, what is
No, you
needed
don't.
to find somebody guilty or innocent, right? Oh, there's multiple testimonies, but to find somebody guilty, there's got to be consistency of testimony that's beyond reasonable doubt. And so I don't know, I fell for these when I was in the Christian world. I didn't critically examine them and go, oh, wait a minute, that's actually kind of silly if you think about it. You hear what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. And you know something, if like, going back to the court example, if you have the same witness contradict himself, that raises even more doubt. And
Right?
so, Book of Acts, they're contradicting themselves in the same book with the same author. And so, again, fiction writers are held to a higher standard. And so, with that, in my mind, the case is closed. It's
Yeah.
fiction, nothing
I mean,
more.
and
So it's
now as
classic
we look
literature.
at it, go ahead.
It's just classic literature,
Yeah,
like
well,
the
yeah,
Quran, like
that's where
anything
I was
else.
gonna go with this. As we look at it, you know, it is literary fiction, you know, Greek literature, and it follows the traditional Greek motifs. You know, the epic story, and there are different elements pulled in it. It seems like it may be pulling from four different types of Greek literature. Um, there may be, if you get into historical Jesus scholarship and the Q hypothesis, there might be oral sayings of a guy who existed, nothing like
Mhm.
what's in the New Testament, but these oral sayings were there. And all you have for most people who look at the first century is there were probably maybe oral sayings of this guy.
Mhm.
And then you have, in the second century, the first written tradition we have is Marcion finds Paul's letters and his proto gospel he wrote, and then you start having other gospels appear in written form. Of course,
Mhm.
Christians say they existed in the first century. There's the oral, the wording. It sounds like something that was written in the first century. Yet we have first text Marcion, then we start having other gospels and epistles appearing, and then this textual tradition just becomes this huge thing by the fourth century. Um, but it's highly dubious that there was any of that grand story in the first century. Maybe sayings, okay, sure, maybe. But then the story has changes, and that's where we have the layers of redaction in the New Testament.
Yeah.
We have different communities with different views of what his life was. And so it was kind of a process of grand narrative making around this guy who may have made some sayings,
Mhm.
until they have a kind of, I say, government conceived plot to make it into a cohesive theme by the fourth century. But that's not really where we're going to go today on this. But if there was a guy, I can't say that the grand narrative story that comes out is what happened. There's no,
Right.
it's again, it's written decades and centuries later, so it's kind of written in a way that's unfalsifiable, because you can't go back and you can't go, well, what was said, what was done. You don't have contemporary witnesses, and so it's pretty dubious.
Right.
um Sorry to go on a tangent. I kind of want to circle back to a couple questions on your journey.
Mhm.
One, you said that you went into Pentecostalism for a while.
Oh yeah.
What branch of Pentecostalism were you involved with?
Oh, it was most recently it was what they call the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada because I moved to
Okay.
Canada as a young adult,
Okay.
and that's
They're kind of related to the Assemblies of God, right?
yeah, they are related to the Assemblies of God in
Because
the
I
U.S.
stayed in a hotel in Lucerne, Switzerland that was owned by them when I did some missionary work when I was a
Okay.
Christian.
Right. Yeah, they have a lot of mission organizations that go around the world. So I think Youth with a Mission, YWAM, is one of the organizations that goes all over the world, especially to Switzerland.
Yeah,
Actually,
I did it. I did a traveling performing play,
mhm.
through like Western Europe that but it was an Assemblies of God thing, but they were kind of working with some of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada.
Yeah, before I moved to Canada, I was affiliated with AOG, what they used to call AOG, the Assemblies of God.
Mm. Oh, okay.
So it was the classic Pentecostal, speaking in tongues, prophecy, that type of thing, laying on of hands. And, there's a lot of the mega churches you see, on TV where people lay hands and they fall down and, you know, been there, done that. Can't say I'm proud of it, but
Mm.
I've been there. I know what it's about.
So I mean, yeah, I mean that kind of to talk about, similarities and journeys and questions about it. Um, so the thing is well, I've got two questions, a statement and two questions, and I'll kind of start with like the question, kind of get in a statement and then let you answer.
Mhm.
But one thing is a lot of the Pentecostal Assemblies of God, of course, they have miracles, laying on hands, speaking in tongues is big, but also I've always seen a familiarity with some of the teaching about festivals and the tabernacle and Hebraisms sprinkled in. So one of my questions is how much of that was sprinkled into your Pentecostal experience? Um, and then the other one is the emotionalism and the use of rising and swelling music. to make people excited.
Mhm.
How much, as a former worship leader, were you aware of, um, like John Wimber, the founder of the
Mhm.
Vineyard Church,
Yep.
talked about power evangelism, that you don't preach until you get them into a certain state through worship, that they're receptive to the word. Now, that's how he says it, but the rising, swelling of music, the emotionalism, passionate preaching, calling people forward to be touched, the social and peer pressure of you got to fall down to get touched from God, almost kind of thing. Like there's an intense it's intentional, it's coerced, and at times
Mhm.
cooperative, that you're being worked up into this state that you're more receptive to the word and the other one is more receptive to giving money. How much are you aware of that in your experience?
Totally, completely aware of that. That was, as someone who was a worship leader, I actually knew of the power of emotional states. And emotional manipulation is a huge thing. They don't call it emotional manipulation because it just sounds too carnal to them. They want to make it sound spiritual. But they would say they wouldn't even call it spiritual manipulation, they would call it spiritual movement.
Yeah.
And so the emotions help tap into um, your soul, and of course now in Judaism, the soul and the spirit are synonymous. It's the same thing. Whereas as a Christian, I thought there were two separate things. It's
Mm.
kind of an odd theological point that we don't have time to get into. Excuse me. But when you are able to get people emotionally engaged, that's when their soul opens up. Their soul it's going to, whatever you share in that state of emotional swelling, to use your words, whatever you say is going to be much more quickly, much more readily, much more deeply without being questioned. So what we would do is the job of a worship team is to basically make sure that people are in an atmosphere where they're emotionally open and ready to receive readily without question. And of course, no one will say that under oath. That's essentially what they're doing, is making sure that people are emotionally engaged so that whatever the preacher says is going to be received openly, readily, with very little question, because their emotions are open. And when your emotions are open, it's amazing how deeply you can accept something as truth. And so, yeah, I definitely was aware. And, there's a very real truth to how emotions can affect you. When you have music that moves your emotions and it makes you open not only to the words of the pastor, but to divine intervention. And when I say that, I will say, and of course, there'll be skeptics. I've seen the miraculous. I have witnessed people say that they got healed while I played piano or while my wife sang. And they'll say, I was this way, no, I'm not this way, praise God. And, I still to this day don't doubt that that actually happened, because I've realized with time that when God gives you a miracle, it's not to pat you on the back and say, you believe the right thing, so I'm going to bless you. When God gives someone a miracle, it's because he's merciful. It's not because you have the right faith statement. It's not because in one of the 40, you're in the proper denomination out of the 45,000 other denominations, so I'm going to touch
Mm.
you. So you can believe something totally wrong about God, and God will still be merciful towards you, and he can still give you a miracle because he's merciful, not because you deserve it.
Well, I have a completely different perspective, and I'd push back on that a little bit.
Mhm.
I don't disagree in psychosomatic healing.
Mhm.
I don't disagree.
Mhm.
So there are Hindus, like there was a Hindu guy doing kind of like this laughing revival thing. It's kind of where
Right.
the laughing revival got its roots in Christianity. Came from a Hindu thing. And he would do similar things, preaching, and people were laughing and people experienced healing. Okay, so people experiencing psychosomatic symptoms of healing is
Mhm.
not exclusive to Christianity.
No, it's not.
It's not exclusive to a religion, and it would take a really long discussion, but there is a majority of the things that people are treated for by doctors are psychosomatic. They're mentally caused
Mhm.
illnesses. A majority of the things we go to doctors for is stress related.
Mhm.
Stress can increase anxiety, asthma, depression, all this kind of stuff. So I think is close to 80% of all the stuff that's treated is mentally related stuff. And in psychology, you talk about a moment of catharsis.
Mhm.
So whatever that point of catharsis is for you,
Mhm.
um, whether it's, a Hindu doing their prayer, whether it's Benny Hinn throwing a cloth at your face, and you
Mhm.
falling out, if in your mind you believe that that relieved what is a psychosomatic symptom of, a trauma or a stress in your mind, you believe that relieves it, then your body, even sometimes when you don't actually have a complete healing, because sometimes your
Mhm.
body will tell you you're okay
Mhm.
and you'll start to feel better. So I would disagree with the statement that it was God or divine intervention. While that
Mhm.
is possible, I would say that a majority of, and because I've been part of a lot of healing, revivals, and
Mhm.
missionary work. And I've never seen a true miracle. I've never seen a person in a wheelchair crippled and walk. I've never seen a blind man see. I've
Mhm.
seen, I feel like 100% were psychosomatic things, things that could have been treated
Mhm.
with antibiotics, things that could have been treated with proper mental health and proper
Mhm.
emotional, stability. Um, I've never seen a true miracle.
Yeah, and I don't doubt that. I mean, with someone else, when someone else recounts what happened to them, there's no way to know for sure.
Mm,
And of course, people are going to be skeptical, but I'll say that there was one point where I had a lump somewhere and it went away,
mm,
So maybe it was God, maybe it wasn't. But either
mm,
way, if it was God, it's not because I believed the right thing. God can
mm.
show his mercy to anybody in any religion.
Yeah. Well,
So
I don't want
anyway,
to spend too much time on that,
right. But your other question about
Yeah.
messianic
Mm,
influence, there was a little bit, honestly, and it was actually quite recent. Um, Toward the beginning of my Pentecostal experience, there was no Hebrew roots influence at all until about maybe 8 years ago. There was a French-speaking church that my wife and I helped minister at sometimes, and they invited us to do music, ministry, and translation because we're in a French-speaking environment. Our church was French-speaking. Our community was French, still is French-speaking. And so we were involved in a French-speaking church for 20 years. My wife still is, in fact. And so one of the things about ministry in Quebec is you invite speakers that speak English and don't speak French. You need a translator. So they requested music ministry and translation, which my wife is excellent at. So they invited this minister from New Zealand who was a messianic. And that was my first experience with a messianic believer.
mm,
And of course, I don't want a messianic Jew. I probably would have in the past, but as of course, I know that halacha does not call them Jews, they're Christians. He's a messianic believer, say.
yeah.
So anyway, that was my first experience with a messianic. And that was my first experience with hearing their message that supersessionism is wrong.
Mm.
And that's highly ironic,
Very.
very ironic, because uh, in my road to Judaism, I've had several discussions with messianics in the meantime, and they all believe in supersessionism to a degree, even though they say they
Yes.
don't.
Well, they do, but
They do, but they don't. They believe
but
in it differently.
let me get there first. But they do, but it's highly convoluted because
Mhm.
they don't want to get into the antinomianism of Paul where he does away with the law. So now we got to kind of keep some of the law. and they want to get rid of the things that lead to anti-Semitism. But the juxt of what they believe is that you have to become a completed Jew, and you're not a completed Jew until you believe in their fictional savior. But that means if I'm completed there, I wasn't completed as a Torah observant Jew.
Exactly.
Therefore, it's still supersessionism, but they
Exactly.
have couched it in a little nicer words. And I was talking to Rabbi Tovia Singer, and he even points out that they eschew supersessionism, but I'm like, they call themselves completed Jews. It still is. It's just, it's the same thing by a different name.
Exactly. And it's very, it's devious, the whole
Yeah.
thing. I mean, they say, the whole thing, as of course it's an offshoot of the Baptist Church. And the guy that started the Jews for Jesus, from which most Messianic movements come, the guy that started Jews for Jesus was born into a Jewish family, a Reformed Jewish family. He became a Christian, decided to missionize Jews. That was his life mission.
Mm.
And so he changed his name to Moishe, changed his title to rabbi from pastor, and basically changed everything to make it look Jewish and sound Jewish, even though it wasn't. So it's the whole thing is just renaming everything so that it looks different, but it isn't different. It's basically it's masking everything, it's disguising everything, and not being forthright and not being honest. It's all about dishonesty. It's avoiding saying the Bible because we don't want to freak out the Jews. We want to call it our holy text. We don't want to call it a church because that'll freak out the Jews. We want to call it a house of worship. And we don't want to call it the New Testament. That'll freak out the Jews. We want to call it the Brit Hadashah. And so it's everything about it is just dishonest. We don't
Yeah.
want to call it what it really is. We want to hide its true identity under a Jewish
Yeah.
piece of clothing. And so
Wolves
they
in
don't use the
sheep's
word
clothing.
supersessionism. Yeah, they don't want to call it supersessionism because it freaks out the Jews. They
Yeah.
call it something else, even though an astute Jew or third party observer will see it as for what it is. It is supersessionism, as
Yeah.
you've described, because they see our faith as, they see Torah observance as inadequate, incomplete, without belief in their Messiah, their divine Messiah, without whom we cannot be right with God, which is totally antithetical to Torah.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it comes across as wolves in sheep's clothing. It's definitely cultural appropriation,
Mhm.
but it's Christians do it in every country that they try to do missions, and they go into Africa or China, they try to adopt the dress and the culture and the lingual. Missionaries when they go to Aboriginal villages, they I remember hearing stories, reading about various missionaries flying into the jungles of the Amazon. Starting out when they learned the language and they would associate whatever the late natives called their god, they would call their god, but then they'd start to add in and explain Jesus. But it's very much what Catholicism did at the beginning. It's a very syncretic religion where it would blend these things together. And like I feel like since the roots of Christianity back to Catholicism, they would always blend things together
Mhm.
into something, but it's a very deceptive practice. The thing that always stuck into my mind and was kind of a jux of my transition, I was involved with Dr. Raymond Gannon. He was part of Jewish Voice in the King Seminary. He was one of the ones who had founded so he came out of the Assemblies of God. He founded a Messianic congregation in the 70s or something like that in LA. Because there's the Baptist ones, and then there's the ones that kind of come from the Pentecostal background and come to the Messianic Jewish um, background. And anyways, he had talked about dressing up, and he's a Gentile who has not converted, but he talks about dressing up as more Orthodox than the Orthodox to convert him. And always like I was reading the book by the Reform Rabbi Carol Harris Shapiro, who she was trying to study Messianic Judaism, and she called it cross-dressing, dressing up in the name of the cross to convert people. And that always just sticks to my mind, but it's cultural appropriation. You're trying to take on the customs of a different people to pretend to be the people to get them to do what you do. And it's so disingenuous.
Mhm.
Kind of to circle back a little bit, when we're talking about the emotionalism of Pentecostalism, the music and all that kind of stuff, for me, what was very healing when I came to conversion in the
Mhm.
synagogue was going to a synagogue service without instrumentation, without rising and swelling music, without
Mhm.
this compelling oratory, and to come forward to have hands laid onto you, and in that moment where you feel good and you feel like things are happening. Now give me a bunch of money, God wants you to tithe, and if you give, you'll be blessed. It felt so great to be in a place that, one, I'm doing something where I'm offering it to God and it's a service. I'm giving him something where I'm not trying to get something back. And for me, what was healing and brought unity to my soul was the quietness of, and being part of that tradition where we're praying the same prayers around the world for the past, few thousand years. I'm doing something that to repair my soul versus I'm here like, Heavenly Daddy, give me stuff. So
Mhm.
that was very healing for my soul. I mean, what has been your transition? How have you grappled with the emotionalism, the music, the excitement of the concert, the performance, to now you're transitioning to you're going through a conservative conversion, right?
Right.
Now do they still have because there are variances, I go to one that has, more traditional service. Sometimes you have ones that maybe Friday night they'll play guitars or something like that. But for the most part, it's just people in a room, a minion doing prayers
Mhm.
and offering them up to God. Like, how is your transition from the excitement, the emotionalism, the concert to, you know, Judaism? How has that been?
Well, it's actually, I'm glad you brought that up just because I do miss the music. The Pentecostal churches have great music, and I kind of miss that. But I also appreciate the tranquility and the authenticity
Mhm.
of being there and not being emotionally manipulated.
Yeah.
But you know something? The whole emotional manipulation didn't really exist until I was a young adult and went into Pentecostalism. In the Baptist church, it was all about Bible, 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 and less about emotional manipulation and less about music. There was some music, but not as, there was some passionate preaching, but not as much of it. It was a lot of Bible study, Bible, 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 Bible. And so I had that balance that a lot of Pentecostals didn't have. And a lot of Pentecostals, I'm just going to throw in a tangent for just a moment. Um, I'm not going to name who she is, but there was a woman that I know very well, and she would frequently say, God doesn't want your mind, he wants your heart. And that's very common in Pentecostal churches to believe that. But in my Baptist rooted mind, I would say, well, God gave me both a mind and a heart. Why would he not want both?
Mhm.
And of course, in Judaism, it's the same thing. God gave you both a heart and a mind. He wants both. But, when you offer your heart, make sure it's sincere and not, the product of emotional manipulation from, I don't know, a preacher that is preaching after some really beautiful music or whatever. So I offer God my heart, but it's not after a period of great rock music that has lifted my soul to the point where, I'm ready to, I'm ready to be excited and receive whatever God has for me. It's going to be something that, it's going to be consensual, if we want to put it that way, on a mental level. And to me, I prefer that just because to me, the mental level, the intelligence level is the bed from which my emotions are based. If I have an emotion, it's ultimately based on something that I believe to be true. So there's a foundation of intellect somewhere within that emotion. So to me, the intellectual level is even more important than the emotional level. So I don't mind not having that emotional manipulation because when God feeds me through the Torah with my intellect, that intellect is going to be the basis from which my emotions are going to come in the future. And so, whether or not I make a decision based on emotions or logic, to me, logic is a more, I guess, I hate to say it this way, but it's more logical because that's the basis for all my emotions. So I've learned to appreciate that over the last year or so of going to synagogue. Even though I'm tempted to miss the show, the music, the lights, um, I miss it on a level where, I miss the fun aspect of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, I have a very deep appreciation for the intellectual stimulation that I get from reading the Parsha or having it read or chanted really in Hebrew, followed by the Haftarah in Hebrew,
Mm,
and following along when I can't catch up with the Hebrew because they're reading so fast, I can, still feed my intellect by following along in English. And then that intellectual foundation, you know, is going to carry me um, not only intellectually, but emotionally.
mm,
And so I've learned to appreciate that. And I hope that explains, hope that adequately explains to you at least
mm,
I guess the transition from less emotion and more intellect and my appreciation of that change.
mm. I mean, I mean, you're essentially going to a rock concert. And who doesn't like to go to a rock concert with their favorite artist? I mean,
Right.
it one, you are encouraged to put your hands up, put your all into it, to dance, to in a way express yourself. I do martial arts, so Bruce Lee, he said art of expressing yourself honestly. So
Mhm.
you try to get people opened up, hands up, giving all themselves. So there's a part of you, even if you're giving yourself up to some imaginary, that it feels good. If I'm just like letting myself be, right? Everybody wants acceptance, whether or
Right.
not, and so it's offer of acceptance, but it's got now when we get into, and we're not going to do that today, but you get into the theology and the foundation, it's not there.
Right.
But it feels good to open yourself up, to be free, you know, those experiences feel good. But feels good when somebody does the same thing at a Beyonce concert or a Jay-Z concert. So it's not the experience itself is not religious, though it's in a religious setting. But you're convinced by the people telling you from the stage it's religious, though I know personally that the churches I went to were concerned about air conditioning because certain levels facilitated the Holy Spirit better than others, which was comedic to me. Just the thought of it put me on the floor like, God needs an air conditioning unit? Are you kidding
Mhm.
me? You've got to
Mhm.
be kidding me. Now, it was enjoyable, but I enjoy a good concert too. I mean, so it's not that it's not. And yes, part of me is like, it'd be nice if maybe there was a truly Jewish movement where maybe they had elements of that. It would be kind of nice. But, halakha when it comes to playing instrument on Shabbat, the reform and conservative, they'll make room for it. Reform more than conservative on that, but they still tend to be a little traditional on their usage of music. Um, Part of me is like, if we could blend a little bit of the vineyard music with conservative movement, it'd be a fun service. But that's not traditionally the Jewish way. So I, but it is enjoyable.
Mhm.
But I want to touch on something you said though. Cognitive emotive or cognitive behavior theory deals with like cognitive emotive theory. It's your thoughts lead to your emotions, lead to actions.
Right.
Now, when people get you to bypass your thought, get into emotionalism, they can control your action. Whereas if it's a thought that leads to emotion, then you're more in control of your action. So, personally, I prefer to my emotions line up with my thought than be led into an emotional state to be led by another person. Um, I don't want to dwell too much on it because I kind of want to transition into what's your experience been as you're, going through conversion. Um, when I was going through, I was doing various experiments on, keeping kosher, working on being Shomer Shabbat, observance of the festivals. My rabbi, he was a conservative rabbi. He had come to part of his Jewish experience was through the Reconstruction movement. But the shul itself was an independent minyan, but my conversion was conservative. Um, but because it came from Reconstruction, it was more of a make Judaism your own and personalize it for yourself. And so we did all these experiments. It was kind of cool, kind of Plus we did Musarts kind of as a spiritual tradition I really enjoyed. What has your experience been as your, you know, uh, taking on kosher, Shabbat? Like what has your
Okay,
experience been as you've been going through conversion?
got it. I'm going to qualify what I'm about to say by saying working closely with my rabbi on this.
Mm,
And so people are going to probably disagree with a lot of how I see things or how I've been going about my conversion. But, you know, my Yiddishkeit, my conversion to a Jewish lifestyle, is basically under supervision between myself and my rabbi. And he and I are comfortable with the process that we have undertaken. Now, with that in mind, and I say it because there will be some critics of my journey, but I'm at peace with my journey, and they have no bearing on my relationship, my covenant with God. So they can think whatever they want to. That being said, my rabbi was raised Orthodox. He was raised in an Orthodox home, but he is conservative. And I believe he's been conservative for, several years, at least 20 years. And of course, our shul is conservative, egalitarian. But of course, we are a little bit stricter in some areas, like the fact that we don't have instrumentation on Shabbat services. And since he was raised Orthodox, he's very strict about, at least in shul, no cell phones on Shabbat. Don't take pictures in Shabbat on Shabbat in the shul. Very strict. When we have a meal after the service, it's always kosher. And of course, he will encourage all of his members to keep kosher and Shomer Shabbat to the best of their ability.
mm,
Now, what that means for me is I live an hour away from my shul.
mm,
First questions I asked him when I approached him for conversion is it a problem if I live an hour's drive away from shul? And he immediately told me that, well, the conservative movement since the 60s has allowed driving to and from shul on Shabbat and Yom Tov
mm.
only. You don't drive everywhere. You can drive to shul and back.
Yeah.
And so I live an hour's drive away. I drive to and from shul. So he is okay with that. I'm okay with that. The other thing is with keeping kosher. I told him that I live over an hour away from the nearest kosher butcher, and I am part of an interfaith family at this point. My second question to him, when I started talking to him about conversion, was, is the problem that I have a non-Jewish wife? I've been married to my wife. At the time, it was a little more than 20 years. Now it's over 21 years.
Mm,
And he said, no, in his shul, that's fine, because with halacha, there is room for a single Jew to convert with no family who may or may not ever have Jewish kids. And so why should not there be room for a member of a couple to convert by themselves who may or may not have Jewish kids? So in his opinion, it's the same thing. He's had experience with converting one member of a couple with a non-Jewish spouse in the past. He won't marry an interfaith couple,
mm,
but he will allow one member of a couple to convert. So there's a difference there. So that's the case with me. And since my wife is still a devout Christian, I am officially in an interfaith household. So that affects my Shomer Shabbat. It affects my kashrut, keeping kosher. And so my kashrut journey, my journey to keeping kosher with my rabbi, is basically do the best you can with what you have. And of course, do the best you can doesn't mean don't worry about it at all. No, it means that, within the bounds of shalom bayis. Since in any interfaith couple, shalom bayis takes precedence. Shalom bayis is peace at home. And so if I try to impose kosher dishes, kosher cookware, kosher silverware in an interfaith household, and it affects shalom bayis, then I can't do it. I have to keep in mind shalom bayis. So with respect to shalom bayis in that environment, I keep kashrut to the point where I'm no longer, I don't eat pork or shellfish, but I don't buy kosher meat because I live more than an hour away from the kosher butcher. And my rabbi's aware of that. He's okay with it. I don't have kosher cookware. I don't have kosher silverware, kosher dishes. My rabbi's aware. He's okay with that. So I do what I can within the bounds of Shalom Bayis. If my wife is ever to the point where if she's comfortable with me only buying kosher meats, going an hour and a half to the kosher butcher, an hour and a half back, paying double the price, then it'll happen. But that's not where I'm at right now. So within the bounds of Shalom Bayis, I keep kosher to the best of those bounds, if that makes sense. Shomer Shabbat is basically the same thing. I don't want to make waves with peace at home because basically, ultimately, I have to be a light at home. I have to make Judaism appear non-threatening to them. But the trick is without, I don't want to be completely kosher free. I don't want to be completely compromised. I have to say, okay, I want to at least do my part, do what I can that doesn't affect the household. I can at least be pork free, shellfish free without affecting the household. But in Shomer Shabbat, I can get away with not using electronic devices and have it not affect anybody. And that's so far, that seems to be working out so far. And again, Orthodox Jews are kind of probably pulling their hair out at me saying all this. But where I'm at with my rabbi and me, and as long as I am doing the best that I can, not putting it aside, but making a concerted effort to actually do it within the bounds of Shalom Bayis, then my rabbi's happy, I'm happy, and that's where I'm at as far as Shalom Bayis and Kashrut and Shomer Shabbat.
Okay. I guess I was lucky when I went through conversion. My wife and son went with me, and so we were able, to transition to kosher dishes. And
Yeah,
we never lived close enough that we had to drive to shul. So I mean,
yeah,
but conservative has accepted that
right.
for, like you said, since the 60s. So you try to keep kosher style. You
Yeah,
don't eat pork. Have you stopped mixing milk and meat? Where I live, so Trader Joe's has kosher meats. There's a Ralph's over here that a kosher meat section. But then again, San Diego has a large Jewish population.
right.
So I've an ease of access to kosher meats.
My city has a Jewish population of one
You?
that I know of.
Oh,
There's nothing kosher. There's
okay.
halal, but there's no kosher
Yeah, yeah.
within an hour's drive.
Halal is not kosher,
Right.
but
It's the closest thing, but it's not
yeah.
kosher.
Well, they don't always drain the blood and salt the meats though. Sometimes they just bless
No,
the meat. So the
it's not the same.
now,
It's the closest thing, but it's not kosher. I
yeah.
realize it's not kosher.
Do you know how to cashier your meats? Like you
I do know
can.
how to, but I've
Okay.
spoken to
Mm,
people who do it for a living, and they say if you buy non-kosher meat, there's no way to make it kosher. Even if you kasher it, if you
mm,
buy it non-kosher, kashering it does not make it kosher.
mm. I've always had access to the meats, but I know that like they were telling me when I went through conversion that you can drain it and salt it and do it yourself. But always an option. But as long as you're working with your rabbi and he's okay with things,
Yeah,
everybody
and
has their own journey. How does your wife feel about your conversion and
she is growing more and more, I guess, tolerant. I'll say
uh,
passively tolerant. She was very kind of resentful at the beginning,
mm,
and it's grown into a passive tolerance. It took a long time for her to allow me to buy Shabbat candles.
oh wow.
It took a long time for her to allow me to buy kosher wine because I can't buy kosher meat within an hour and a half drive,
Mm,
but I can buy kosher wine and I can buy kosher dairy. So, and of course, fruits and vegetables, you don't really have to worry about it. So I
yeah.
don't worry about it. But as far as everything else, I mean, she passively accepts that I will drive to and from shul once a month. And right now it's not more than once a month because with Shalom Bias, and of course I've had this discussion with my rabbi, we have one family vehicle right now.
Mm,
And if I take the vehicle an hour away, I have to leave the house at 8:30 to get there at 10.
mm,
And of course, the service lasts usually till 1:30. And if there's a kiddush afterwards, I might not
mm,
leave till 2, I might not get home till 4. So I have to deprive the family of the family vehicle for close to 8 hours. So with respect to them, I can't go to shul more than once a month. So when I go to shul, she's passively tolerant of the fact that I will go to shul once a month. She's passively tolerant of the idea that I cover my head and I wear a kippah under my cover. She doesn't like my kippah. Um,
Is she a
and
Christian? Does she come from a Christian background?
oh yeah, she's very devout. She's still a
Does she
worship
not
leader.
know that in the New Testament Jesus is said to wear talits and tassels and
It doesn't matter.
doesn't matter?
To her, the tradition is, the Christian tradition is it's considered impolite to cover your head indoors, and especially at the dinner table.
Yeah.
Whereas I started
Except for
doing it
the
almost
Pope
immediately.
and them, they have their little
Yeah, that's it. And one of the first things my rabbi told me is that he said, we cover our heads when we pray, when we eat, and
yeah.
study Torah. And when he said we, I mean, nobody told me to do. When he said we, this is what we do, I considered myself as part of the we, and I started doing it.
Yeah.
And of course, he told me it doesn't have to be a kippah. And I said, well, since I'm converting, can I wear a kippah? And he said, well, of course, since you're converting, it's not appropriation. It would be appropriation if you were trying to integrate it into a non-Jewish lifestyle.
Yeah.
But since you're converting, you can wear it. So I wear a kippah under my hat, and I wear a hat over it in public so I don't get, lynched. Or, if I don't get attacked, because in Quebec, anti-Semitism is very, very high. It's very
Yeah. I
rampant.
mean, if there's only one other Jewish person there, then I can imagine it's unfortunate.
Yeah, so I'm very careful to cover my kippah when I go out in public, and when I'm at home, I can just wear my kippah, especially if my wife is in the other room. And it's a funny thing because I've been wearing a kippah full time since October, mid-October, shortly after the attacks. I decided, I'm not just going to wear a flat cap anymore. I'm going to wear my kippah just to remind me of who I am and whose I am at all times. And my wife still doesn't like it, but she's starting to get sensitized to it. I'm starting to normalize it step by step, and it just takes baby steps to get people used to it. My son is used to it. My wife is. I hope to have her used to it soon. And it's kind of a funny story. The other day I was doing dishes, and I was just wearing my kippah, and I heard her in the other room, and she was coming in. My instinct was like, put on your flat cap. She's coming. And my other voice, my inner voice said, no, no, no. Don't put it on. Let her see your kippah. I want her to see the kippah. So she came in, she saw my kippah. She didn't argue. She didn't give me a hard time. She just said what she needed to say and left. And, so it has to become a little bit normalized bit by bit, step by step. And that's kind of where I'm at in this transitional phase of being this new reality of being an interfaith household.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like you're doing your best to manage it. How long have you been married?
At this point, a little over 21 years.
Okay, good.
And when I announced to her that I was converting and I was no longer Christian, we had been married over 20 years, and so it was a shock. I had to spend a couple nights on the couch, and we had some very frank discussions of whether I wanted to divorce her. The answer was no. Whether she wanted to divorce me, the answer was no. Whether she wanted me to leave, the answer was no. Whether I wanted her to leave, the answer was no. So
a little bit of tension there, huh?
a bit. And of course, it's a little bit is still there. I won't lie. But in an interfaith household, I mean, that's part of the reality of being in an interfaith household. When we got married, we had a Christian wedding. And the whole basis of our even knowing each other was on the premise of loving Jesus. And so that's been taken away from her. And so there's still a little bit of resentment that is still there that comes across from time to time, but she's becoming more and more, I guess, again, using my term, passively tolerant. It is becoming a little bit less aggressive or less resentful with time. And so with time, it's just going to, it'll resolve itself. And, we have the rest of our lives. I mean, hopefully in the next 30 years, I mean, she'll at least be open to visiting the shul maybe once or twice. Who knows?
I mean, there's time. I mean, it takes a while for things to grow on people, I guess. Yeah, so I mean, when I first married my ex, we had a Messianic wedding, and then we went through conversion later, and then we had a Jewish wedding. And since we already had the Jewishness built in, it wasn't so hard, and she kind of went along. Well, she wanted to go through conversion, and so did my son.
Mhm.
They both actively chose to do that. So I mean, it was nice because we were able to do it together as a family. It was wonderful to go to the mikvah with my son. Like that, the mikvah was
Mhm.
a wonderful experience.
Mhm.
Forever cherish that. I don't want to go on too long here. I'm gonna ask like a last basic set of question. And this is kind of about, so you're moderator in a few Facebook groups.
Yeah.
Kind of deal with common objections. What's the purpose of it? What are some of the common objections and stuff that you deal with there? And kind of what's your goal behind, moderating the various groups on, leaving Christianity for Torah, the other,
Mhm.
the name is like Noahide Judaism. I don't know, it's a bunch of
Yeah,
the
it's
names.
Judaism, Noahidism, Messianism, and Christianity is the main group that I started. That was the first one I started moderating. It's an interfaith group where it is basically it's a Tanakh discussion group where people discuss the Tanakh, and Christians and Messianics are welcome to join in the discussion. And so there's a lot of discussion on reconciling the ideas that a lot of Christian ideas are actually New Testament mythology that don't line up with Tanakh. And so there's a lot of Christians that are shocked and offended at the idea that their beliefs are not universally accepted, and it's not an echo chamber, that we're not going to wave hankies and yell amen when they say Jesus is Lord.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's an interesting point of view on being a moderator in an interfaith context, and I bring my personality with me and my I guess my experience as a moderator. I've been moderating Facebook forums for over 20 years. Well, not Facebook, but online forums. Even
Mhm.
before Facebook existed, I did online forums and I was a moderator going back to the year 2000. And so I have a lot of experience with making sure things are civil, making sure that people attack arguments and not each other.
Yeah.
And so, and I try to bring in my personality in the sense where, I told you in the past, I left Baptist theology for Pentecostal theology, and I became a little bit of a fundamentalist for a while. And I actually had resentment against my former faith, the Baptist faith. And it took me years to get over my resentment toward Baptists. And it took me a while to get over the fundamentalist personality. So when I made the transition from Christianity altogether to Judaism, I had the same focus. I wanted to keep the same lessons with me. I basically told God, I don't want to be fundamentalist,
Mhm.
and I don't
Yeah.
want to hold hatred
Yeah.
toward my former faith, because a lot of the people, you know, I can hate the teachings or disagree or strongly dislike the teachings, but I can't hate the people. There's some great people, great sincere
Yeah.
people who are just sincerely wrong.
Yeah.
And so I try to encourage people to have the same approach in their interfaith dialogue, and I try to demonstrate the same thing. And so when it's a Christian, I try to do my best to question, to challenge their arguments without insulting them. And of course, since Christians are accustomed to being agreed with all the time, they get offended when their ideas are challenged, often, not all of them, but often, very often, too often, in my opinion. I have to tell them, hey, look, I'm challenging your opinion. I'm not insulting you. And sometimes they'll realize that I'm making sense. Sometimes they'll just pick up their toys and leave. But my goal in interfaith dialogue is to challenge opinions, challenge belief statements, while remaining civil. Because if you push people away, they're not going to listen to the truth.
Mhm.
If you insult them and mock them, they're going to pick up their toys and leave. They're not going to stick around long enough for it to hear what you have to say, let alone listen to it and try to make it make sense. And my job, as a converting Jew at least, is to be a light. And I can't let my light shine. People are not going to see my light if I'm just making fun of them all the time. A light they have to be drawn to it. So I'm not going to mock them as a person. I might playfully mock a belief system or challenge a
Mhm.
belief system
No.
or a faith statement or an opinion.
Mhm.
I might go so far as to call it New Testament mythology, even though they don't like that. But it'll make them think, okay, is this really a myth? There's usually I use certain words deliberately to get people to provoke thought
Mm.
because God invites us to reason together. And so that's really my whole focus and my approach toward interfaith dialogue in Facebook. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, you seem to have a pretty balanced attitude there, and I mean, when I got into Christian apologetics when I was involved in Christianity, so I don't know if I ever got to like the fundamentalist phase, but I definitely was into a phase where I was heavily into apologetics.
Mhm.
But when I got eventually to the point of converting, I got to the point when I converted to Judaism, I just want to be a human being.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean that I enjoy the life that I exist in, and you know, if the light shines, it shines through. I don't know, the goodness of like me as a person, what I experience as a person versus me trying to convince other people of what I believe. It's very interesting. Like I had no plans to start like this whole podcast blog thing. Um, because because I converted 2014. So it's like 10 years now, right? um, I had no plans of doing this at all. Um, and then somebody, because I was engaging, I on a few of the forums there just started answering and dealing with questions because I've been to Bible college and ministry and all these things. So I have information in my head I just wasn't using, and I started interacting with people. And then I started getting podcast interview requests, and I'm like, okay. And after doing that, then I was talking to other people and lined up some interviews and stuff. And like my goal in this isn't to convince people of the truth, but to share things I learned on my journey for those interested in going on a similar journey themselves. Whether people do what I do or something differently is irrelevant to me. Like, I've found things helpful on my journey. So if I can share things that are helpful to others on their journey as they question, look at things through reason, try to have a sound mind, try to be grounded, look at, facts and history, not just what people want to tell us. So I mean, I've tried to have more of a holistic approach, understand people's emotional mental state, that people are, they good people strongly believe things they've been led to believe that may not be
Mhm.
true. They're good people. They want to do good. It's why they believe it. Therefore, just telling them it's a myth or a lie is, it's a challenging thing. Now, sometimes when you state those facts in forums, you get like the common thing I see is the character assassinations. They start coming at you pretty hard. And
Mhm.
it's hard for me to fight my sarcastic urge to say uh, very similar things back to them.
Mhm.
Just kind of human nature, I guess. But, in general, I'd rather be helpful than harmful. But,
Oh yeah. One thing you hit on, which I want to hit on as well, is just the freedom. You said that you got into this phase where you were into apologetics, and usually apologetics that usually means missionizing to me,
mm, mm,
letting your light shine aggressively to the point where you tell other people how to live,
yeah,
should believe.
yeah,
And one of the things that I find so freeing with Judaism is there's no proselytizing.
yeah,
We don't proselytize. We just let our light shine. We just do the right thing. And if somebody is attracted to it and they ask you questions, sure, you answer their questions, but there's no pressure to tell people how to live or what to believe because we're judged ultimately by what we do, not by believing the right thing. So that to me was one of the biggest feelings of relief that I've felt in a long time. Just no pressure to have to go out and, win souls or anything like that.
yeah. Yeah, it's nice
Love
to
it.
not have to, it's funny. They talk about works in the law. It's nice to not have to work for God, to
Yeah.
go out and have to try to convince and convert people. It's funny how Christianity creates a false dichotomy. yet they create new works and new laws, but that's a different
Yeah.
discussion for another day. So I want to thank you for coming on here. It's been a good
Mhm.
conversation. I'm glad we got to connect like this. Is there anything you want to say last minute, like wrapping up here? Like,
No, nothing really to add other than if anyone is listening out here on your podcast and they feel like they would like to um, consider Judaism as an option, if they're not satisfied with Christianity or they see discrepancies that they're not familiar with, talk to Jeremiah, reach out to Jeremiah, or reach out to myself, reach out to a rabbi. There is no commitment when you do that. It's just reaching out, asking questions. There's no obligation to become a Jew if you do that. And so, if you feel like you have questions, you see a light that is intriguing, and you want more information, again, reach out to a rabbi that you know of, reach out to Jeremiah, reach out to myself. We'd be answer any questions you may have.
all right, great, excellent. Well, thanks for coming on today. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pulling the Threads podcast. We're at the pleasure to interview Ben Wagenmaker. Make sure you like, subscribe, and follow, and share this podcast everywhere you can. And I want to thank you for tuning in. Have a great day.